Hi everybody, happy Friday, happy story time. I'm glad to be with you today. Look at these beautiful flowers. These colors remind me it's fall. And the door open over there reminds me that the weather has cooled off. It's such a beautiful time of year. Very interesting little creations. That is actually a flower that came from the earth right there. Well, I have a book for you today called Cranberry Autumn. It's a book about a little girl named Maggie and her grandmother, kind of an odd character named Mr. Whiskers. So they have a little adventure, and in the book, something really sweet happens. So I can't wait to read this to you, and I hope you enjoy it. The maple trees were turning yellow. A salt breeze came from the sea. Summer had ended at Cranberry Port, and soon the schools would be open. School again, and we have no money for school clothes, said Grandmother to Maggie. And you need a new winter coat, said Maggie. Grandmother thought about friends who needed extra money before winter set in. Maybe it was time for the whole town to have a big sale. Everyone had old things in the attic, dolls or toys or furniture, or things become scarce. They become antiques. With Grandmother's help and spirit, the Cranberry Port antique sale began to take form. Aunt Hester on the next farm had a set of blue dishes to sell. Seth from the general store found an ancient high chair, and breathless Mr. Whiskers, their neighbor, hauled over his treasures for Grandmother to see. A stuffed swordfish without a sword, a lobster claw lamp, his second best bathing suit, a fruitcake left over from Christmas. Grandmother held her head. Mr. Whiskers, haven't you any sense at all? Get rid of that rubbish, she cried. Mr. Whiskers carried it all home in the cloud of gloom. Suffering codfish! Couldn't he ever please Grandmother? Grandmother and Maggie began to look through their attic. They searched through the trunks and boxes and closets and drawers, and suddenly Grandmother uncovered something rare and special. A pair of painted china dogs wrapped in a silk shawl. Staffordshire dogs, cried Grandmother. Made in England over 100 years ago. A prize, Maggie. They carefully carried the dogs down to the kitchen to prepare for the sale. News of Grandmother's sale spread to other towns, and large crowds were expected for the day. The antique sale opened, and Mr. Whiskers still hadn't found anything to sell. He stood at Grandmother's table of antiques and sulked. No one needed him. Mr. Grape, Mr. Whiskers, mean neighbor, stopped by Grandmother's table. He couldn't take his eyes from those beautiful Staffordshire dogs. $200, he read on the price tag. If he could get rid of Grandmother, he could outwit that foolish Mr. Whiskers, and those dogs would be his for a small price. He rubbed his hands together. Oh, how he loved to trick Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Grape tugged on Mr. Whiskers' sleeve with the message that Grandmother was wanted on the phone. Oh, dear, said Grandmother. Mr. Whiskers, will you please take care of my table? Me? Cried Mr. Whiskers. Suffering codfish. What if someone wants to buy something? Price tags are on everything, Grandmother called back to him. While Mr. Whiskers turned to sell a silver thimble, mean Mr. Grape cackled and removed the price tag on the dogs. I'll take these, as he handed the dogs to Mr. Whiskers. No price tags on them, but they were $20 this morning. Suffering codfish, Mr. Whiskers bumbled about. What do I do? Trouble already, no price tag. A lady in an orange coat pushed in. Wait, $20? Why, I'll give you $200. $300, offered the man in the tweed coat. A crowd began to gather. Up and down went the price. Mr. Whiskers wheeled from one bid to another in a baffled surprise. $600 at the end of the bidding. Mr. Whiskers had sold Grandmother's dogs for $600. Mr. Grape stooped down and disappeared into the crowd. Grandmother returned and heard Mr. Whiskers' news. How wonderful! "Why, you are just too smart for that mean Mr. Grape," said Grandmother. "What would we do without you?" She clapped her hands. "I'm a hero," Mr. Whiskers announced to Maggie. "A hero!" Later, at Grandmother's house, they celebrated with dinner. Maggie would have new school clothes and Grandmother her coat. "Are we going to share with friends?" asked Maggie. "A new coat for you," Grandmother announced to Mr. Whiskers. "Me? Suffering codfish, never." "This was my grandfather's." Mr. Whiskers shook his coat. A gold button fell off, and 2 winged creatures flew out. "Were those your grandfather's moths too?" Grandmother asked. Mr. Whiskers hugged his coat tightly around himself and stepped outside. "You are a wonder," Grandmother called after him. Well, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but agree. He smiled through his whiskers and headed home over the dunes to his little gray house by the sea. Just another day of triumph for the old sea captain. How about that? Mr. Whiskers had a wonderful day that day because he was so helpful to Grandmother and to Maggie. And I love this picture, this last picture of the shadows of Mr. Whisker going home to his family. And here, if Miss Nancy can get up close, is a recipe for cranberry squares, the kind that the grandmother used to make. Anyway, that sounds really good. Cranberries and oats and flour, butter and sugar and walnuts. Oh my goodness, Miss Nancy, we might have to make some of those. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed our book today. Happy Friday, and I hope you have a great weekend. Bye-bye.